Chapter 6 is called Reinforcement Beyond Habit. And what it actually does is look at some of the more applicable aspects of operant conditioning, specifically in terms of how we use reinforcement. Video 1 will go into a little bit more information on what this chapter is about before looking at something called shaping and chaining. Video 2 will then look at how we can apply reinforcement to better understand problem solving, creativity, superstition, and an important aspect of social psychology called learned helplessness. So to start, we know that operant learning is more than just breaking down behaviors. But what else does reinforcement actually teach us about human behavior? We know that oftentimes the behaviors that we see aren't necessarily new. For example, oftentimes when we're trying to solve a problem, the solution tends to appear to us, or at least seem like that light bulb goes off and we've suddenly discovered the answer to a problem. However, when this happens, most of the time, rather than generate a new behavior, we've switched a behavior we already have to a new form. This explains things like creative acts, and oftentimes mysterious, unpredictable, unknowable human behavior. These experiences are thought of by behavioral psychologists to be accounted for by the law of effect that we learned when talking about the foundations of operant conditioning. So to start, we want to look at how this principle can be applied for something called shaping. Shaping research began by looking at how we can train specifically birds to engage in new behaviors. So think back to B.F. Skinner's box, the rat in the box example, where he trained mice to press a lever in order to get food. You may wonder, when you look at that example, what happens if the rat never presses the lever? The mouse has never pressed a lever before. Why is it that we can get it to start pressing a lever? That's a new behavior. Does the behavior just happen accidentally? Does it come out of nowhere? Is the mouse so hungry that it starts randomly engaging in all sorts of behaviors and eventually presses the lever and learns? This is where shaping comes in. This is another phenomenon discovered by B.F. Skinner, and what he found was that reinforcement of successive approximations or small indicators of a behavior can eventually produce a desired behavior, and it can do so very quickly. So what this means, and this more complex B.F. Skinner language, is that you can actually reinforce small aspects of an overall behavior. For example, when he was trying to train the mice to press the lever, he would start by reinforcing slight movements towards the lever. Anytime the mouse moved in the direction, it would be rewarded. Eventually, it would arrive at the lever. Maybe it looked at the lever, he would reinforce that, and eventually it would press the lever. This sort of behavioral establishment, called shaping, as I mentioned, can actually very quickly establish a behavior. So what I want you to do, and when you have a chance, is to watch this video. You can find it in the slides. And what it's going to show you is B.F. Skinner training a pigeon to turn in a circle. It takes a couple of minutes. The bird goes from not ever turning in a circle to literally rotating in a complete circle on demand. He uses the principles of shaping. He reinforces small aspects of a behavior in order to teach the pigeon an overall big behavior. And that's what shaping looks like. Interestingly enough, we know that shaping is something that does occur naturally in our environment. For example, I want you to imagine a toddler throwing a tantrum in the grocery store. The toddler does not just one day discover that if they pitch a huge fit, they'll get attention from their parent. What happens is that over time, they learn small aspects of that big behavior. Maybe they start by learning that mom or dad responds when I cry. Mom or dad responds when I scream. Mom or dad gives me attention if I'm flailing my arms around. And over time, they piece those behaviors together and produce a tantrum. That's a very naturally occurring example of shaping. It explains the appearance of new forms of behaviors in the kind of more animal world as well. We know that natural selection shapes species in the same way that parenting or raising a child in general can shape a tantrum to occur. And eventually, new forms of a behavior will evolve because of variation in natural selection. Interestingly enough, we know that when we're talking about shaping, we can either be describing one specific behavior, like a tantrum, or a series of behaviors and acts. This is called a behavioral chain. Before I go into what a behavioral chain is, I want you to think about a complex series of behaviors you engage in to accomplish a bigger goal. For example, when I'm making these lecture videos, there's a lot of steps I have to go to in order to accomplish my overall goal of producing a video. Many of the behaviors we commonly engage in involve a lot of smaller behaviors. For example, unloading your groceries or even driving a car. It's not just one behavior, but rather a chain of behaviors. And that brings us to chaining. A behavioral chain is any connected sequence of behaviors that accomplish a task. For example, predators searching for prey. They stalk it, they pursue it, they kill it, they eat it. It's a series of behaviors. And when we're talking about behavioral chains, they usually have to be done in a specific order. So the question here is, how do we learn to do these behaviors? The process of chaining is similar to shaping, but involves these more complex series of behaviors. So chaining is teaching an animal or person to perform a behavioral chain. The first part of chaining is something called task analysis. So I want you to go back to your behavioral modification project idea, and for a second, think about a more elaborate series of behaviors, a behavioral chain. Once you've thought of something, I want you to pause the video or pause it and give yourself time to think about it. And then I want you to think about all of the different aspects or components of that behavior. This process is called task analysis. And before we can successfully chain a behavior, we first have to analyze its components. If you're having trouble thinking of a behavior for yourself, maybe think about one for a pet. So pause the video, think about an elaborate behavioral chain, and break it down into a few different components. When you're done, proceed with the video. So you might have noticed when you were breaking down whichever behavior you thought of that there might not necessarily be one clear approach to chaining it. In fact, there's two primary ways we can go about doing this: forward chaining and backward chaining. These approaches are pretty self-explanatory. Forward chaining is when you start with the first behavior and proceed to the end. Backward chaining is when you actually start with the end behavior and proceed backwards. And interestingly enough, we know that starting with the last link, that kind of end result, and working backwards tends to be the most effective, because that last aspect of the behavioral chain is what has the strongest association with the reinforcer. So I'm going to show you an example. Just to give you a little bit more information, with forward chaining, you begin with the first link in the chain, proceed to the second, and so on and so forth. You reinforce shorter or progressively longer chains until you get to the end, etc., etc. Backward chaining, I have this information in here in case you want to look at it. It goes exactly the opposite way. You start at the back, and then they have to perform the preceding behavior and the last behavior and so on and so forth. But this is the example I want to give you. And this was a real laboratory experiment done in 1978. And what these researchers did was use behavioral chaining to teach a mouse to go through an elaborate series of behaviors and eventually get fed at the end. And what they did was they started down here and trained the rat to climb the ramp. They did this by using shaping, okay? They reinforced the rat every time it got closer and closer to the ramp, and eventually through shaping it learned to go up the ramp. Then they taught it how to cross a drawbridge, to climb a ladder, walk across a tightrope, climb another ladder, go through a tunnel, step into an elevator that carried it up, and then it had to press a lever to get food. Imagine for a second this contraption being at the top. That was forward chaining. And it worked. They were able to teach the rat to do all of these behaviors. Then they did it backwards. They fed the rat. Then they fed the rat and it pressed the lever and they fed it again. And then they proceeded backwards down the series of very specific, strange behaviors to teach a rat to do. And they learned that doing it backwards was the most effective way. But both approaches work. So this is just kind of a very complex, elaborate example of what behavioral chaining looks like. And the very specific example of how behavioral chaining can teach you very strange behaviors you might not otherwise engage in. Interestingly enough, when we're talking about chaining, it's not just the N reinforcer that we're looking for. We know that each link in the chain actually reinforces itself because it provides the trainee with the opportunity to perform the next step. So each time you accomplish one aspect, you're rewarded because you get to move on to the next thing. And that's what makes chaining so effective. It has small reinforcers along the way, and then ultimately a big reinforcer at the end that motivates all of the smaller behaviors. But without that last reinforcer, chaining is not going to work. At the end, there must be that same level of contingency where the animal is rewarded, usually by food. Without that last reinforcer, the chain of behaviors will break down. You have to have that production of reinforcement at the end in order for this process to be successful. That brings me to the end of video 1. Video 2 will look at a few really unique and interesting aspects or applications of chaining, shaping, and reinforcement as a whole. We'll talk about problem solving, superstition, and one of my favorite aspects of social psychology to lecture about.